Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let's move to the second session, panel session. This panel session, we are going to have 120 minutes, 120分钟, separated into two parts. Part one is 100 minutes, mainly opinion exchange among panelists on the stage. The second part is open for floor discussion. 第二部分就有观众的这个问答。The language we're going to use among panelists is up to them, whatever they feel comfortable. But we can always have an earpiece to have real-time translation. Let me briefly introduce the four panelists today. The first is Morris Chan. Morris is the CEO and chairman of board of TSMC, perhaps the most one of the most successful semiconductor company in the world. And the second one is Nelson Chan. Nelson is the vice chairman of a cement company, Jiaxing Suini, and also runs several hotels around the world. Third one is former Chief Justice Lai Yingzhao. Dr. Lai is now a professor of law at Zhongyuan Daxue, Zhongyuan University. The fourth is, of course, Thomas Piketty, our honorable guest today. He is a professor of economics at the Paris School of Economics. Originally, I planned to separate this opinion exchange on a stage into two rounds, but I also understand this, any plan is just a soft plan. Anyone can talk in a way they like and in a topic they prefer. So all I hope is that this opinion expression for each panelist can be concise and preferably less than 10 minutes so that we can have more than two rounds of opinion exchange. That is the whole focus of a panel discussion. The final thing I would like to say is that some people may observe that some of the panelists on the stage are rich, and some are not. But I hope that we don't look at this way. This is not, what's going to happen is not an opinion confrontation between two camps, between 1% and 99%. That's not the case. This panel discussion is an exchange of wisdom and insights. And we hope from this panel discussion we can form as much consensus as possible, not to find differences between us. So I am going to start this. Let's start with the senior person. We are Chinese society. So Morris, would you like to start?
谢谢。这个麦克风在响吗
Yes.
Okay, good. 我首先要说，我对 Dr. Piketty 的著作以及他今天的演讲，非常的佩服。他是用一个很严谨的研究的办法来做这个收入财富分配的研究。我想 ，Dr. Piketty 他对自己的著作也是有相当的期待的。的确，我觉得他会是一个未来的诺贝尔经济奖的一个可能的人选。那他对这个他的著作的自己的期待，我想是可以从这个著作的这个书的名字，就是《资本论》，只是加了一个21世纪，这个是跟19世纪的另一个《资本论》是简直可以说是同名的啊。事实上，假如是诺贝尔奖在马克思还在世的时候就已经存在的话， 马克思的《资本论》也会得到诺贝尔经济学奖。但是这个并不表示这个是著作，这个是马克思的《资本论》，或者是甚至于 Dr. Piketty 的今天的《资本论》是对的。事实上，马克思的《资本论》是带来了20世纪的很大的灾难。共产主义奉它为圣经，那事实上是受难的人民，我想是要以亿万、10亿万来计算。那马克思是主张是阶级的斗争，他是认为历史就是阶级斗争的这个记录。那他认为阶级斗争也会造成，在阶级斗争的结果一定会是革命，会是战争。那今天在这个书上 ，Dr. Piketty 说。他的态度对这个财富不平等、收入不平等，他的态度是比较温和。那我必须讲，我的态度比他更为温和。我认为收入不平等、财富不平等其实不是问题，不是社会问题。但是要有3个条件，有这3个条件的话，收入不平等、财富不平等不是问题，不但不是问题，而且是我们要的。这3个条件是什么呢？第一个是要有一个安全网，就每一个国家要有安全网。安全网的意义就是使得没有一个人有这个衣食的担心，每一个人也有健康保险，这个是一个基本的安全网，我觉得这个是一个条件。第2个条件就是要有公平的税制。所谓公平的税制，我觉得是收入高的人的确是应该多付点税，但是最主要的还是把税基扩大，就是收入都应该付税，把这个避税、逃税的途径都把它堵住。那一个公平的税制也不应该有很高的税率。刚刚 Dr. Piketty 也看了这个80%了，90%了。这个英国跟美国，英国是在这个战后1940年到1979年1979年是 Margaret Thatcher 上台，她把这个英国的这个所得税把它降下来很多很多啊。那美国在1950年代、1960年代，也是这个所得税税率最高税率，也是到70% 了，甚至于90% 了什么。那后来这个 Reagan 是把它降低下来，这些税率70%、80%、90%实在是太高啊。那老实说，我这在预先讲一句，那个Dr. Piketty 建议的所得税是我记得是100万美金或者是欧元以上左右，就是要 80%的税率啊，那甚至于这个20万欧元以上就已经要好像是50-60% 的税率，这个我是觉得是太高了是，那个好，第3个条件，第1个条件是安全网，第2个条件是一个公平的一个税率第3个条件是一个平等的机会。平等的机会，我想我在第2轮的时候也许在讲得仔细。我的意思就是主要还是教育，教育是最能够这个提供平等机会的。所以假如有这3个条件，安全网、公平的税制、平等的机会，有这3个，我不认为这个收入的不平等以及这个财富的不平等是一个问题。收入不平等，我想很多自由派的经济学家，这个应该是包括这个 Paul Krugman 以及我相信 Dr. Piketty 在内，自由派经济学家，他们都非常怀念60年代、70年代、50年代那几十年，在那几十年当中，比方说 CEO 一个很大公司的 CEO， 他赚的待遇是一个基本功能的几十倍、40倍啦、50倍啦这样子。那现在呢？一个 CEO 大公司 CEO 赚的是一个基本功能的几百倍。那在自由派经济学家的眼光当中，几十倍是不算太多，几百倍太多了。那我倒要问了，今天这个演讲，我也被邀请为一个 panelist， 我相信在讲完以后，我们的主办人会给我1万块台币左右的酬报。那 Dr. Piketty 呢？我相信，可能是几百倍哦。假如不是几百倍的话 ，then Dr. Piketty, you have undersold yourself. All right. Also,
no, sorry.
Well, you have really.
I think I have 0. I'm sorry to tell you, but I've never heard about receiving anything for this.
Well, all right. Now, then I must give other economists as examples then, because the speaking fee, 他们的这个收入的确是，这是市场决定的，我是觉得是，市场决定是他们演讲费是应该是几百倍，我做 panelist 的这个酬报，我也很高兴啊，我也没有不服气啊，是。而且，假如是不出这个酬报，他们不来，那我们就少了一个学习的机会了。好，我想我现在暂时说到这里，我看时间也是差不多了。等一下，假如有机会的话，再讲下去。
Okay. Thank you. Before Thomas Piketty flied here, we communicated through email communications that whenever someone provide provocative comments, he would like to respond as soon as possible to avoid a situation that a good question is skipped after a long waiting. So he prefers to separate his 10 minutes or into different parts. So Tom, would you like to?
Yes, thank you. Well, I will try not to take 4 times 10 minutes because of this rule, but so you say we need a social safety net, we need fair tax system, we need education. You know, I agree with these 3 points. The question is, what is a fair tax system? You know, how much progressivity, and how do we determine, you know, whether a top manager should be paid, you know, 10 times, 40 times, 100 times? And you seem to say, you know, why do we stop at 40? Why not 100? Why not let the market speak? I think this is not convincing because, you know, the market is not a sort of natural and you know, magical force that always puts the right price on you know, different individuals. You know, I think the market, in the case of top managers, you know, is always manipulated in one way or another because we don't have perfect information and we will never have perfect information on individual productivities. You know, what's the contribution of a particular individual to a very large company? So institutions are important. You know, markets are embedded in institutions, labor market institutions, corporate governance, these are institutions. And I think the tax system is also an important institution that limits, you know, incentives sometimes to take too much from your company. And, you know, I think there is a lot of evidence when I look at the data that I have and I look at the managers who get, you know, say 10 million instead of 1 million from their company. This is just not related to any observable indicator of performance. And if anything, I observe in the data I have used, you know, it was not for Taiwan, so maybe it's different in Taiwan, but in North America, in Europe, in Japan, I see a bigger elasticity of pay increase for managers when there is just cash on the table. For instance, when there is more profits in a sector in general, or when there is a, you know, oil shock or shock to some exchange rate that make a sector more profitable independently of the manager performance, because this happens for the entire sector. You know, this is when the pay increase are the biggest. So this has nothing to do with incentives or performance. And finally, I think that looking at the history of tax rate, you know, is a way to get an idea of what, you know, what were the effects. You know, I don't see a higher productivity growth in the US economy after the Reagan years than before the Reagan years. You know, if you compare 1950, 1980 with 1980, 2010, you know, after Reagan, you see rising inequality everywhere except in the productivity statistics. I mean, there is some innovation in the US economy, but overall, the productivity growth rate, you know, has not been terribly good. So if you have such a big share going to the top, then you have stagnation of median income. And I think this contributed to
I will defer my answer to later.
To the speaking fees, I'm sorry, I want to return to this because, you know, that's very interesting discussion. You know, as far as I know, at least nobody has proposed me a speaking fee for this, and you know, I don't want any speaking fee. You know, I already get too much money with my copyright, and you know, I will be happy to pay a lot of tax on my copyright, and you know, I will be happy to pay even more tax on my copyright, and certainly I don't need speaking fees. And every time I am proposed speaking fees, you know, I refuse because I don't want speaking fees. But indeed, in the world, there are lots of people who have too much money, you know, to spend on speaking fees, and of course you have lots of people who are happy to receive them. But this has taken proportions. You know, after my book was published, I received, you know, people sending me my email, you know, telling me, okay, we want you to talk with, you know, with this group of investors. We pay you, you know, $50,000. I say, no, I don't want to do that kind of stuff. They tell me, okay, we give you $100,000. And I told them, well, look, I said no. And you know, these people, you know, what this shows is that, you know, and these are the same people who are going to negotiate the wage of their unskilled workers like crazy, and who are going to say that they cannot pay $100 more to their worker, and they will say that in the name of economic rationality, and then they are able to spend $100,000 just to get me for 1 hour. This is economic rationality. What this shows is that these people have access to the resources of their company in proportions that are just unjustifiable by economic rationality. And this has to do with power. This has not to do with economic rationality. So I think, you know, it's important that we have this discussion today.
Okay. Okay, Nelson.
I think Morris used Chinese, I'm going to use English. Today's topic is actually growth and inequality. I am not going to specifically address Dr. Piketty's book, but however, within my talk, we'll make some reference to it. And topic will start basically on growth and inequality. And I'll start with the Christian Trinity we talk about is Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But the modern Trinity we talk about is democracy, capitalism, and individualism. But both capitalism and democracy empower individuals, and at the same time, tolerates the differences in personal values and personal choices. Neither imposes ideology nor moral religious value on society. Capitalism allows for the bridging and the shrinking of culture and religious differences. On a macro level, the expansion of freedom in international trade will result from a decreasing in conflict between nations through mutually beneficial trades. On a micro level, self-interest is a motivation in market activity. French Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire believed that commerce provides the means through which people of different backgrounds can cooperate and help each other. For Voltaire and Scottish philosopher Dave Hume, human civilization was a world of art and science, of technology improvement, and of a greater well-being of society. However, 18th century Genovan philosopher Rousseau felt material progress had increased inequality as well as undermining our virtues. Science and knowledge was unequally distributed, so they will lead to a more equal inequality in a society. In the last 30 years, science had leapfrogged us so much that now Rousseau's point of view started to dominate our society. It is true, capitalism is based on self-interest, but it is also based on self-esteem. As Ellen Greenspan once pointed out, integrity and trustworthiness are the capitalism's cardinal virtues. It demands men survive by the means of virtue, not by vice. It is very important to acknowledge that both systems rest on the fundamental principle of respect for human autonomy and individual dignity. It is unfortunate that the impulse to acquire and the pure pursuit of greatest amount of money had become the only noticeable point of this capitalism. We must remember, capitalism and Protestant work ethics go hand in hand. The risk of entrepreneurship turned into rentiers is not very high. Today's topic is growth and inequality. The most straightforward point of view is that one should not sacrifice equality and justice for growth. But if the topic changed into survival on equality, the answer could be entirely different. The most basic instinct for human nature is survival. In fact, for all living things, the primary instinct is self-survival. Only after that's accomplished, we will start to take care of our kin. Therefore, equality is an important attribute only after survival. So equality, to some extent, is a luxury in a time of plenty. For that being said, 21st century excessive inequality still will result in costly destabilizations of the world. First century Greek writer Plutarch once wrote, "An imbalance between rich and the poor is the oldest and the most fatal ailment of all republics." Noah Webster also said, "The causes which destroyed ancient republics were numerous, but in Rome, one principal cause was the vast inequality of fortunes." So I do believe the world's inequality is increasing, but would it be as bad as the past devours the future? That is debatable. However, I do support some forms of progressive income tax and capital gains tax. Just one note, Taiwan does not have capital gains tax today. I also support some forms of inheritance-gift tax. I believe it is a form of wealth tax. However, like Morris, I do not support an extreme form of progressive tax. History is an important reference to human culture and social development. I would like to start history from the way, way back. 12,000 years ago, man started to come out of a hunter and gathering way of life and started to form agrarian society. Mankind based the structures of first village, first government, first society, and to some extent, first religion on the basis of food production and distribution. So we cannot only look at distribution side of the equation without considering how it will affect the production side of the society. I believe the success of our current society has reached a pinnacle point in our human history. It is still improving. I believe the success is based on equal opportunity and unequal results. I want to emphasize unequal results. It is the unequal results is the main driving force for our society. According to Aristotelian principle, the individual in society should be offered the opportunity to flourish to a maximum ability, but this does not imply equal outcome. The equal opportunity, which is going to echo basically Morse has said, everyone receive equal justice. Of course, justice is a huge topic, as Michael Sandel's Harvard lecture on justice will tell you. Equal opportunity in education and training. Third, receive similar level of medical care. Fourth, able to get basic daily necessity of life. So I have one little more than Morse had. Of course, perfect equal opportunity is difficult to reach, and everyone's definition of equal opportunity will be different. However, I do believe in the 20th century philosopher John Rawls' position in the veil of ignorance. That is, a just society should be chosen by people who have set aside considerations of their own gender, wealth, race, patronage, etc., and etc. Ideally, this rule eliminates persons' bias from choices, thus guarantee the fairness of the rules. I also agree with his belief in the difference principle, which stipulates the responsibility or burden should be distributed according to ability, but the benefits according to need. Rawlsian philosophy can be the basis of our egalitarian society. It's a direction which, again, does not, however, require similar outcomes. By using punitive tax to equalize results will destroy people's aspiration as well as practice of diligence. Just imagine an online game such as Angry Bird or Candy Crush has a limit to the highest score. Whenever a player reaches a higher score, you deduct from it. How many copies do you think this game will be sold? Imagine another one. If a school have an A+ grade student, would his grade be deducted because someone received a C? Basically, men are not born equal. Just look at the differences in height and sizes. However, this does not mean everyone does not have equal rights to begin with. In the turn of 20th century, Pope Leo XIII said, people differ in capacity, skill, health, strength. And unequal fortune is the necessary result of unequal condition. Such inequality is far being from disadvantageous either to individuals or to the community. Ancient philosopher Aristotle also pointed out that the worst form of inequality is try to make unequal things equal. There always will be 1% of people in science, music, art, literature, or for that fact in any field. It will always be this 1% who will make the breakthroughs for the world. It is the marginal changes in our DNA which has caused the evolutions in mankind. It will be these marginal 1% people who will continue to change our society. Any excessively punitive way on distribution, I believe, will affect the basic drive of human race. However, I also believe it is still the responsibility of society to take care and support the basic needs of everybody. Winston Churchill once said, the inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings. The inherent virtue in socialism is the equal sharing of miseries. For all the faults of capitalism, it is still the system that has improved the lives of billions of people on earth and for the past couple hundred years. To summarize, equal rights and equal opportunity is a necessary feature of a just society. According to Rawlsian principle, progressive tax is also a necessity, but not to a punitive point. To me, this means a total effective tax rate should not exceed 50%. After all, most of us do not work for the government. Capital gains tax, which also includes real estate tax, should be also implemented. This new form of tax will, of course, have a big effect on our market. And we have seen that before. But I believe this can be implemented through a defined period of time, let's say 10 years. Every year has equal increments, so impact will not be too big. I also believe inheritance and gift tax should be considered. All being said, I do not believe the problem of infinite accumulation of wealth will exist, because Fortune 500 companies have life expectancy of 75 years. Most fortune dissipates through time. The Chinese have a saying, fortune will not last 3 generations. Look at some of the wealthiest people in American history. Those wealth can match the nations, such as Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, John Astor. I'm sure most of you had never heard of John Astor. Where are their wealth today? I think partially because the European has old money, partially because it has a historical aristocracy background. But anyway, last but not least, punitive tax structure, which affects the entrepreneurial spirit as well as aspirations to achieve greatness, should not be implemented. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Nelson. Thomas, would you like to respond? Actually, Morris mentioned the highest marginal tax rates. That part you didn't answer. Why don't you respond to Nelson altogether?
Yeah, let me say that I agree with the abstract principles. I am very much Rawlsian. I think you find Rawlsian tradition in many different country philosophical tradition. I start my book with Article 1 of the Declaration of Rights of 1789 of the French Revolution, which was very much a bourgeois revolution. And Article 1 says social distinctions must be based on common utility. So you can have inequality, you can have social inequality, social distinction, as long as it is in the common utility. So as long as it is in the interest of the poor, I have no problem with inequality. And of course, I will never prefer, equality in poverty. So I think, there's no disagreement on abstract principle. But then you jump very quickly in your very last slide to this 50% number, and I think you go a bit fast, because you are with Aristotle and John Rawls, and suddenly you have a number for the ideal tax rate. And, this is this final step, which I think would require a bit of elaboration. And so the kind of elaboration, I try to bring to the table is how have these tax rates changed over time? And you can see, progressive taxation of 80 or 90% was not invented in the Soviet Union. It was invented in the United States of America. And this is very much compatible with democracy, the rule of law, and a dynamic economy, let's look. I think the problem is that sometimes I feel that some people are not ready for this debate, but let's look at the evidence. How did it work? What were the negative side effects, the positive side effects? What were the impact on productivity of managers as compared to today? Is it useful to have managers that are paid 10 million? To me, it's a pragmatic question. It's a problem of data. It's not a problem of abstract principle. And maybe that's the disagreement between the two of us, is that we agree on abstract principle, but I want to see the data. Is it useful to pay managers 10 million rather than 1 million? And finally, for the inheritance tax, so you said no more than 50%, so would you say the same for inheritance tax? I understand, the tax rate for inheritance in, what is it in Taiwan right now?
It's 10 now.
Okay, 10%.
Drop.
So would you recommend 50% also?
I think it should be below 50.
Ah.
I think just very fast one.
So you have another...
50%, actually, I made it one phrase. The reason I didn't explain further is because I got 10 minutes. I don't have much time. I said
we used to have 50% inheritance tax.
Yeah.
It's been reduced to 10% in 2009.
So you think it should go up again?
I think it should be higher. But anyway, the key is that anything above 50%, I feel I was working for the government.
You feel, but it's not only a matter of feeling. We have to look at what system works well, and
Okay, let's pause here. We listen to the judge.
谢谢各位贵宾，我的主 PowerPoint OK。OK， 今天有2个主题呢，一个就是公平呢，一个就是成长。那我就想到我大概是民国57年呢，刚开始到台北来。那个时候来这边念书，我在学校附近呢，一个房子租一个很小的房间。那个房东呢，在一家上市公司上班，他每天大概7点多钟就出门，晚上到7、8点钟甚至更晚才回家，一个礼拜工作6天，然后靠他这一份薪水养活全家，太太3个小孩。过了2、3年呢，我注意到。那个就是在现在叫民生东路，当时还没有民生东路这个穿过这个松江路， 开始有一个很知名的建设公司呢，在那边盖一栋这个很好的公寓，在当时来讲，一坪卖2万块。我这位房东呢，当时很想去买，不过后来嫌它太贵，一坪2万块太贵，买不下手。但是过了大概这个40-50年呢，我看到我们那一带民生东路这个建国别路那一带呢，现在新推出来的房子大概一坪都上100万。所以40-50年中间的话，大概涨了大概40-50倍。那今天各位朋友，你在这个地方开会，假定你是30年前、50年前，在这个地方买一块地或者买个房子，我想它所带给你的价值，金钱的价值，会比你30年、50年辛勤工作累积的薪水要多好多倍。那么这一种情况，那么就是回顾到今天 Thomas Piketty 他的这个书里边，就是这个资本的报酬率，那么比这个经济成长或者比这个薪水都要高。那这个情况是不是我们宪法所要的看到的一个愿景？那我们宪法的前言，我想今天邀请我来，大概因为我就是可能过去跟法律的接触啊。我们的前言就写说，我们是根据孙中山先生的遗教来制定的。那么中山先生他在1919年的时候有一篇演讲，他当然赞成企业的发展。今天我们张董事长也好，我们张执行长还有在座很多位董事长，对国家都非常有贡献。发展的企业，我想对很多这个就业都非常有帮助，我们非常的尊敬。那不过中山先生当时的想法是，他认为说要防止资本垄断，要防止贫富不均。那宪法的主稿人，各位都知道，真正写我们现在这个宪法的主稿人张金曼先生，也是一场了不起的人物。那么他当时看到公司这个制度开始出来了，然后他就忧虑到说，会不会有产生一些贫富不均状况？当时他的预测的话呢，跟 Thomas Piketty 这个书里边的当时的这些想法也是一样的。他多而不均，富而不安呢，是今后必至之事。他当时的预期。根据这样的一个了解，我们的宪法用了10个条文来写经济政策，然后它的目标很清楚，就是希望达到国计民生的均足，那也就是一个均富的目标。然后它的一个主要的方法，一个呢就是平均地权，一个就是节制资本。那平均地权方面，他是希望说，譬如说刚才讲30年前、50年前，我们在这个买一块地，今天增加了好多倍的这样的一个价值，这个部分的话，他希望能够涨价归公，这个是写在宪法的条文里面，而不是只是一个演讲的一个理论啊。那他特别也注重到这个土地分配的问题，他不希望说有人来垄断，因为当时的那个时代，各位知道，以农立国，土地是最重要的一个资源。节制资本方面，那么他的想法是公用事业，比如说今天各位手上都有带手机，手机就是一种公用事业。那你用这个水、用这个电、用这些公共的这一些这个运输啊，那基本上就是他写的就是公营为原则啊。那当然可以有私营，必须受国家的管理。那私人的财富啊，应该受到法律的限制等等。那这些东西不是中山先生或者张金曼先生自己独创的，其实这是仿自1919年德国的魏玛宪法。那我们看到在那个时代有很多宪法事实上都有类似的条文，亚洲譬如说韩国当时也一样。那不过各位知道呢，我们的宪法呢是在一个烽火连天的时候诞生的。那1947年实施，那负责来解释宪法的大法官第2年就成立了。但是你可以看到这边呢，一直到第3届，1967到76 9年的中间呢，只有24件解释，1年呢不到3件。所以宪法很多条文其实并没有真正贯彻了执行。经济层面方面，那么看起来好像这个中间也有一些讨论的空间啊。那我在大概30年前吧，开始加入政府。那个时候最熟悉的政策就是经济自由化、经济国际化、贸易自由化。我们那个时候写税法，写这些证券的法律，写这些 银行法、金融法律，很多其实是受到美国的影响。那譬如说，在税制里边，刚刚提到我们宪法规定的土地增值税，就是写要非因施以劳力资本增加的部分，那么就是要涨价归公。但实际上的话，我看到这个是联合报大概3天前的这个报道，很巧。那有财政部长到立法院去报告这些事情，结果立法委员追问了，说到底这个如果说有人买了这个地保，那现在的话卖掉的话，大概会是什么情况？那么他说他有跟他算过，他说呢，出售一幅地保的话，获利大概2亿元，大概可以课到450万的土地增值税，但是没有所得税，所以实际上的获利的话，这个税率的话大概2%。那换句话说呢，100块的增值里边的话，大概是绝大部分是归私的啊。那在整个这个所得税里头，各位知道这个 Warren Buffett 曾经投书《纽约时报》，一定各位都读过这样的一个文章。他说他一年呢，这个去年这个2010年交的所得税是690多万美金，看起来非常多，但他说100块钱里边的话，只有缴了17块4。他办公室里面的20个人在帮忙的助理、秘书等等的话，大概33到40亿，平均是36块钱。那最主要原因，也就是说，用钱赚来的钱税率比较低，然后呢，用工作薪水赚来的钱反而税率比较高。那么这是我想今天我们的主持人朱院士呢，他还参加了中央研究院的有一个赋税改革的这个政策的这个建议书里边呢，他有这个统计，我把它引用啊。在美国的话呢，薪资所得100块钱里面呢的这个所得税里边呢，薪资所得缴了56块多，非薪资呢只有43块多。然后如果是这个 OECD 的话呢，薪资所得48块多，非薪资所得多一点51块多。那么这个数字刚才我们这个台银的这个董事长了，这个已经有这个提过啊，李董事长他说我们现在薪资所得是75块，非薪资所得是25块。那么这样的情况的话呢，是不是会有一些可以检讨的空间？那我也同意刚才我们的张董事长、张执行长提到这一些税的这些部分啊。那么全球化的底下，说是要加税，其实是蛮困难的，因为全球化的意思是大家都要吸引投资，那吸引投资很重要的因素之一就考虑到税率的问题。你如果税率定得高，可能就跑掉了。Thomas Piketty 教授在这个地方，他们法国政府有这个刚刚讲到100万的欧元以上的话呢，要扣75%税。那这个中间还打了宪法官司，刚开始打输了，后来之后打赢了啊。那他们就是扣到75%税啊，就扣到这个75%的这个税。那自由这个全球化之后，当然大家知道，其实大家竞相吸引人才。好的人才可能薪水就比较高，被吸引走了。那这个中间对贫富的差距，事实上是有影响的。那皮凯迪教授提到的就是说，资本报酬率高，其实我们现在在看到的就是说，税负反而比较轻。不但这个报酬率高，反而看起来这个税负呢反而比较轻。那这个是不是我们所要看到的啊？那现在就是说，有关台湾的财富平均的状况，也有很多不同的看法。有人认为说，我们现在是凭这个看这个数字来看，是有一点在发生一些变化，越来越不平均。底下一个问题相关的，就是经济成长之后，到底谁享受经济发展的果实？换句话说，假定我们今天可以这个每年经济成长超过5%，那到底这个5%是到谁的口袋里面去啊？那这个当然也是可以考虑到的啊。那么这个图也可以显示出来这个趋势啊。那面对这个现象，刚才张执行长特别提到引述 John Rawls 很多这些这个先生的这些看法。那其实这个是有论辩的。那么这个是标准的 libertarian's view 啊，就是尊重自由意志论者 Milton Friedman 来过台湾。他认为就是说，还是要尊重市场体制，尊重自由发展。但是当然有不同的声音啊 ，Ronald Dworkin 啊，那这是一个非常了不起的一个这个法律学家，当然还有很多，甚至也是 egalitarian 啊。那他是不同的看法，他认为说政府应该要介入，应该要给每一个人有平等的关怀。那这个当然跟张董事长刚刚提到要有安全网，其实是想法还是一致的啊。那 在美国总统他的回应呢，其实他也是很注重这一块。你跟他看这2、3年来他的重要演讲，几乎每个演讲都会提到这一点。换句话说，他希望呢，他就 making sure our economy works for every working American。他希望说，每一个辛勤工作的人都能够共同公平地分享经济发展的成果。那我想这个愿景事实上也是我们宪法所要的这个愿景。那么我最后在这个阶段，我就提出一个建议，也就是说，每一个人对我们台湾现在到底这一些财富分配怎么样，所得分配怎么样，未来应该采取高的税率或其他措施，有很多不同意见。我想今天我们联合报王董事长在这个地方，各位同在这非常好的一个 forum， 非常好的一个论坛。我希望政府能够尽可能开放相关的资料给学者研究。我知道资院士开始也在做这个研究，还有很多位学者能够真正做好3件事情。第一个事情，到底台湾过去的50年，这些财富跟所得分配发生了什么事情？把事情弄得清清楚楚，不要做一些很猜测性的东西。第二个就是从这个事实里边发现关键的问题，到底我们问题出在哪里？是财务方面越来越好，还是越来越不好？那最后呢，要从这个问题里面对症下药，针对问题所在，找出效用最大、成本最低的方法，一步步来做。我想这样子，我们的台湾呢，一定明天会更好。谢谢大家。
Okay, thank you. Thomas, let me brief you the situation in Taiwan now. Our highest marginal income tax rate is 40%. Our inheritance tax rate is 10%. That was reduced from 50% in 2009. Originally, the highest marginal tax rate for inheritance was 50%. Okay, we can move to the second round. Morris, you obviously you have something unsaid yet.
Well, I think I will first respond to Professor Piketty on this unequal pay question. I think Dr. Piketty is right that there's really not enough information. When I talk about free market, when I say that the free market determines CEO's compensation. But it's not, as some people, including you, have said, it's not, even though there's not enough information in the market, I think there is sufficient information for the responsible people, the compensation committees, to know what the market rate is. And of course, you pointed out that it's almost independent of the CEO's performance. That's true too. It is independent of the CEO's performance. So in that sense, it is not very fair. But if the compensation committee or the board wants good performance, they cannot be sure that they will get it. But unless they pay a certain amount, they won't attract anybody any CEO that has the chance of delivering the performance they want. So that's what it is. And certainly it's not a conspiracy. I mean, I think some people make it a conspiracy as though that they say that the CEO in all cases, or in most cases, recruits the board, and the board, therefore, just scratches his back. It's mutual scratching. I don't think that that's true here. Well, actually, a lot of things besides CEO's pay is determined by the market. I still believe that. Now, Let me just go on to talk about the three conditions that I mentioned for unequal pay or unequal wealth not to be a problem. I really think that the three conditions are first, a safety net. I'm not going to talk any more about that. My time is limited. Second is a fair and equitable taxation system. I have no problem with progressive tax. How progressive does it get? I really think that I agree with Nelson's view. 50% is, I think, about as high as one should get. 50% top bracket is about as high as one could get. Now here, I certainly do not agree with Dr. Piketty's view that the tax cuts did not increase innovations, etc. Well, I really think that we have had a lot of innovations. Whether they were due to tax cut or not, I don't know. But innovations, I think we certainly, I mean, the last half century, the last quarter century, I think has been a very productive period as far as innovation is concerned. Information technology, biotechnology, most productive period. All right, my second condition, that's the equitable. I really also think that the trade-off of equality is lack of incentive. You know, if a person cannot get rich at all, then you will see far fewer formations of new businesses. If a person cannot get rich, well, why did Columbus discover America anyway? It was because he wanted to get rich. And he opened up lots of opportunities for billions of people in later times. And if you take away the incentive of getting rich, then there will be very many fewer formations of new businesses. And there will be less employment, and everybody will be poorer. I think that has already been proved by China when they switched from communism to its own style of market economy. It is China's own style, but it is quite close to the Western capitalistic style anyway. Now, on my third condition, equal opportunities. I think there are many ways. Well, all right, just go back to my second on taxation. I think that the inheritance tax, I think lowering the inheritance tax in Taiwan to 10%, I think was a mistake. I think it was a mistake. So I am very much in favor of raising it again. By the same token, I think that the U.S. Also, or the Bush tax cut, of course, later on, it was voided. So the inheritance tax has gone back up again in the U.S. Because, lowering it, I think, was a mistake. Now, the wealth tax, that's Dr. Piketty's proposal. He himself pointed out that at least in the foreseeable future, it is not feasible. It's not practical. Everybody will have, every country will have to do it, and that is just a vision. But if it happens, if Dr. Piketty's proposals on both the income tax, the draconian taxes, I think they are going to create problems. They take away, on the income tax side, you take away incentive, and on the wealth side, well, you also take away incentive, and then I think it's a problem. Now, on equal opportunities, here I think most of the opportunities are probably in education. And I now want to speak about Taiwan education system. I really think that it's in very, very bad shape. It is, I think that improving our education system, which is equivalent to making opportunities more equal, is probably going to be far more effective, a far more effective way to equalize, to avoid social problems, far more effective way than high taxes on wealth or on income. Now, how do you do it? I think it comes to basics, comes down to basics. Now, I'm going to switch to Chinese at this point. 我觉得是第一，我想啊，是以前我们常讲四育啊，德、智、体、群，甚至可以加一个美、无育，这个都是很重要的。这个是跟进来的最近几十年的在台湾的这种只是注重考试成绩，完全是不一样。那我觉得是这个四育、德、智、体、群，还是把它拿回来。那第二，我是觉得我们是要，这是从小学开始，是要改进，是要增强这个普遍的12年的教育，小学6年小学，6年中学，普遍的这个义务教育12年，可是并不是注重所谓明星学校而是普遍的，使得80%人吧，都是有良好的小学12年的教育。大学我是觉得是应该是比较选择性的，而且不应该是义务教育。这个是我的对这个改进教育，我相信改进教育这个制度，我相信可以把这个机会做得平等的多。12年义务教育普遍的要，而且要把这个品质，把这个教育12年的教育品质要普遍的要把它提高，不是只是在明星学校里头，普遍把它提高，而且要德、智、体、群4个兼重的这个教育。大学是比较是选择性的 这个只是给能够用这个大学的这个教育的这个学生让他进去，也许是全部的学生是30%、50%，也许，而不是全部。
Okay, thank you. We don't have to stick to the order. So whoever want to say something in the second round, feel free.
Well, let me say that I believe education is really the most powerful way to reduce inequality.
Thomas, please.
In a way, I think education is much more important than progressive taxation. I think we need to do both. I don't think we want to oppose them, but I think education and having more inclusive investment in education is really the key, and a big part of the success stories in development in the post-World War II period, in particular in Asia, come from education systems that are relatively inclusive more than in other parts of the world, in India or Latin America. And so I think that's absolutely essential. Now, in the long run, 30% or 50% of a generation to university, maybe at some point you will want this to be higher. But I agree that it's a matter of chronology. I think to have we also need more transparency in our education system. In the sometimes there's a lot of hypocrisy. Sometimes in many countries you see a very large gap between the official meritocratic discourse in the education system, the meritocratic ideal, objective, and the reality of how much money you put into the schools to which normal people go. And I give some number for the US at some point in the book. I show that the average income of the parents of Harvard University students, right now corresponds to the average income of the top 2% of the US distribution of family income. So, of course, you have some students who come from below the top 2%, but they are so few, and the students that come from the top 2 come from so high within the top 2 that the overall average is as if students had been picked at random within the top 2% of the US distribution of family income. So, the gap with the official meritocratic discourse seems particularly high here. But, it's a problem in every country. In the US, you have these very high tuition fees, but in Europe, I can tell you in France, sometimes there's a lot of hypocrisy. We invest sometimes 3 or 4 times more public resources in the school where the elite is going than in where the most disadvantaged students are going. So I think there's also a need for much more transparency to see who is going where and who is benefiting from what public resources in education. If I may, I would also like to respond to what you said about the annual wealth tax. First of all, what I very much agree with what you said about, transparency. What I really conclude from my research is that we need more transparency about income and wealth dynamics so that we can adapt our tax rate to, whatever evolution we have. If the top of the distribution is not growing faster than the average, I see no reason for very steeply progressive taxation. But if the top of the wealth distribution is growing 3-4 times faster than the average, then the discussion is a bit different. So I think, to me, the most compelling argument for an annual wealth tax is that this is the best way to produce information about how the different wealth groups are doing. So an inheritance tax is useful, and I'm happy to learn that you all seem to agree that the inheritance tax rate should be increased in Taiwan, and I don't know if this will happen, but there seems to be some agreement. But the problem with the inheritance tax, of course, is that it happens only once in a lifetime. But if you want to have information about how wealth is changing in a country every year, you need an annual wealth tax. Let me also be very clear about the fact that you can do it with low tax rate to produce the information, and then you can adapt to whatever evolution you observe. Every country has wealth tax, at least in the form of property tax. And property tax, in the US, in the UK, for instance, are very large. The problem is that these are wealth tax that were created 200 years ago at a time where wealth was mostly about real estate property and land. and where financial assets and financial liabilities were much less important than today, and this is why they are not taken into account. So these are typically taxes that are proportional and that are only on real estate values. And this can be a problem because, you know, in the US, after the subprime crisis, you had people who had a real estate property whose price was below their mortgage, so they had negative net wealth, and they were still paying you know, more tax on their properties than someone who would have had millions of dollars in financial assets. So I think what I would be proposing is not to increase the overall property taxation, but to keep the same tax revenue as property tax revenue right now in the US, in the UK, in France. You know, I don't know about property taxation in Taiwan, but in US, UK, France, I will keep the same level of property tax revenue, and I will transform it into a progressive tax on net wealth. And, you know, you can do that, you know, so that would be reducing the tax for most people, you know, the people who are trying to access property. You know, if you have a 400,000 euros apartment, but a 380,000 euros mortgage, you know, your net wealth is very small. So in my system, you would pay much less tax than you do right now. And I will increase it for people who have more than 1 million or 2 million euros or US dollars in net wealth. So it's not. So this already exists. We already have property tax. It's just that we'll make it progressive. The objective is not to increase the total taxation on wealth, not at all. The objective is to increase wealth mobility, and I think this can be done at a national level. You know, including in Taiwan. Now, of course, if you want to have higher tax rate for very high wealth holders, then if you want to have really high tax rate, it requires more international cooperation, and we can talk more about that later.
Okay. Nelson?
We were asked to say some solutions if this inequality happens. So I have some solutions. Basically, I think the biggest problem we have today is actually the financial sector. If we look at the 2013 numbers, 7 out of 10 largest companies in the world in the financial sector, and 4 out of 10 most profitable companies in the financial sector. I realize I'm saying bad things about the financial sector. I can lose some friends, and most likely this particular speech is also sponsored by the financial sector. It may not be very smart to do that. But anyway, basically, the financial industry was actually developed by the Dutch in the 17th century. And it was further developed by the English later on after the Glorious Revolution. But the purpose of a financial institution was to support real economies. I have no question that the modern financial industry has facilitated and helped the growth of our industrial economies. But it is, I believe, a very important part of the modern world. But I think without proper regulation, financial industry has been a major source of problem as well. I'm going to have a list of the problems from the Dutch tulip mania of 1637 to all the way to what's happened today in the global subprime crisis of 2007. We're not out of it yet. Those are not histories. Financial problems are not histories. Financial crises are not histories. It will come back time and time again if we do not regulate it. And in history, if you look at history, every 10 or 20 years, there's a banking crisis or financial panic somewhere. Okay, in Taiwan, we felt less of that. We had major problems, 1997 Asian financial crisis, but actually worldwide it happened all the time. And as the economy become more global and financial industry become more dominating part of our economy, actually the phrase too big to fail is going to come again and again. But I do believe the world needs a stable and a strong financial sector. In 2013, there were 5.3 trillion dollars of transactions per day happened in the financial sector. And total world GDP was $74 trillion. That means every 2 weeks, everything we produce being sold and sell once. Okay, so I think financial sector is driving so fast is because really the unadulterated greed in the financial sector. But it should be regulated. But what happened? President Clinton enacted Financial Services Modernization Act of 1999, and short known as GLIBA, which fundamentally revoked Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, which limited business activities allowed for the commercial banks, investment bank, and security firms for 70 years. The new concept of the universal banking, I think, is the problem. Because if I'm depositing money in a saving deposit. I'm willing to take 0.5% or 1% because I want to save. Meanwhile, the bankers took the money and speculated it. And whatever they make will create the incentives for their pay, which is whatever, 100 or 10 times, 1,000 times, whatever it is. Meanwhile, if the bank got in trouble, the whole nation bailed them out. Cannot be correct. So I believe the global coordinated regulation of financial industry is even more important than the global cooperation on taxes. I believe we do not have this regulation worldwide. I think financial industry has grown way over its essential need. And another major problem, global problem, is around the corner. Financial instruments and financial industry is no longer a transaction medium. It becomes a goal unto itself. In some extent, for the religious people will say, it almost has replaced humans' ultimate salvation. And on top of that, I think financial industry is also the main cause of income inequality. I believe the financial industry recently doesn't produce a heck of a lot other than fictitious money. And over-leveraging, over-valuation, excess greed of speculation, uncertainty, unwhole behaviors will continue to haunt human society. The current mentality of financial industry will continue to foster and encourage these behaviors. I think the worst evil in the world today is greed. It can be greed for money or greed for power. Regardless, the greed concepts caused by lack of knowledge advocated by Plato or lack of a will to resist temptation by Aristotle, it should not be condoned. Let's talk about greed for power. Is it true that income inequality will destabilize the society? But do any of you recall a disastrous event in the world history caused by income inequality? It has always been the over-concentration of political power and the misuse of political leadership resulted in human tragedies. The democratic system today we have does not have the ability to solve this problem. Please remember, it was the democratic Greeks who sentenced Socrates to death. It was the Florentine republics who exiled Dante and Petrarch. It was the democratic election elected Hitler and Mussolini. Popular election is only a small part of the democratic system. A successful democratic system requires proper check and balances and constant participation of all its citizens on countries' important matters. It was clearly pointed out 2,500 years ago by Plato in his book, Republic. Democratic system is not a perfect political system. It has its share of weaknesses. We just talked about, Lai Yuanzang talked about the Constitution. 1787, actually, the United States had a constitutional debate. Most people thought U.S. Constitution existed, but actually U.S. Constitution did not exist until 1787. During the Constitution debate, the anti-federalist paper had pointed out again and again, over-concentration of political power is a danger. Also, the anti-federalist paper also pointed out that government will spend as much as they get in tax revenues. We are seeing this in the most recent sovereign debt crisis. For the crisis countries such as Portugal, Spain, Iceland, Cyprus, their tax revenue as a percentage of GDP was around 40%. France, Italy, around 44%. Some of these countries, after collecting so much taxes, they are still heavily in debt. Some countries are spending more money on interest to service the debt than on education. So I do not believe taxes are the only solution to the balanced budget or income inequality issue. Of course, it depends on individual countries. I think if not careful, more taxes will go to more waste and more inefficient use of resources, and in some extent, an unnecessary concentration of political power, as well as giving the unneeded temptations to some politicians. When a tax rate exceeds 50%, can you imagine a government is bigger than all the private sector put together? In the heydays of Roman Empire, it took 18,000 people, that's all, to run all the Roman provinces, from British Isles to Middle East and to Africa. Let's remember, no government is truly benevolent, and very few actually operated in the traditional spirit of the civic republican virtues. As 17th century English political philosopher said, Thomas Hobbes pointed out in his book Leviathan, that a government is a necessary evil and needs to be supported by taxes. Well-functioning government is a necessary condition for commercial society, which is the source of creativity and the spirit of entrepreneurship. Democratic system and capitalism both rely on ethics and morality. Our earth does not have limitless resources. For our world to go on, require all of us to be more tolerant, more caring, and guided by moral values. We are not born with good virtues. 17th century philosopher John Locke made a famous Aristotelian concept, tabula rasa, which means blank slate. We need to be educated with rights and wrongs. Plato believed the true virtue must be taught and need to be practiced. However, true equality should not be forced. It must come from education and from each individual's hearts. In conclusion, private business capitalism goes way back in human history, has thrived side by side by guided capitalism and welfare capitalism. Successful capitalism is to find the right mix. Government should act as a capitalist only when capitalism has demonstratively failed, and government need to redefine and reinforce the rules under which fair competition can take place. Last but not least, I do believe in a true laissez-faire mode, private capitalism can produce enormous wealth, but it also can cause a series of social and political problems. It has a tendency to concentrate wealth in the hands of few. This, together with fast advancing technology, can split society into a new type of aristocracy and a class of economically difficult plebeians. What is needed are visionary leaderships, political leaderships as well, and a functional political system which can balance between fair competition and a system of governance to pursue social justice, a dynamic balance between entrepreneurial capitalism and social welfare capitalism. Thank you.
Okay, Nelson seemed to identify two evils of today's inequality. One is excessive expansion of the financial sector, and the other is the excessive expansion of political power. Thomas, would you like to say something about it? Anything happened similar in France?
Yes, so excessive financial deregulation is clearly responsible of an important part of the inequality dynamics that I describe in my book. So, very large remuneration in the financial sector, sometimes with absolutely no relation with how much they bring to the real economy. And also, financial deregulation has probably increased the inequality in financial return between different size of portfolio. So, when I say R is bigger than G, well, not everybody gets the same R. So, the rate of return that you get with a small portfolio these days is not always very good. Whereas at some point in the book, I look at the return to large university endowments because we have good data on this, and you can see, the bigger the endowment, the higher the return, and probably financial deregulation has contributed to make large portfolio able to access very sophisticated financial derivatives, whereas the rest of us has sometimes lousy financial products. And so, according to the textbook model, more sophisticated financial market should allow everyone to get the highest marginal product of capital on the planet, but the real world doesn't seem to be working this way. Now, regarding excessive government, let me be very clear about the fact that, when you have countries with tax revenue of the order of 40 or 50% of GDP, this is already very high. And I am not saying at all, and I think nobody is saying that this should go, to 60, 70, 80%. So, I think when you have 40, 50% of government you need to be very careful about how you spend the money. And I think this is sustainable. This should not go higher. This is sustainable only, if you are very careful on to spend it well. So if you spend it well, this can work. In Europe, there are 28 countries. If you take the richest country, the most productive economies, Denmark or Sweden, they have 40% or 50% in tax revenue. The poorest country, Bulgaria or Romania, they have 20% of GDP in tax revenue. So, if it was enough to have low tax to be rich, then Bulgaria and Romania would be richer than Denmark or Sweden. So, it all depends what you do with the money. If you invest it well in high-quality public services, good education, good health, like in Denmark or Sweden, then it's okay. In France, you know, sometimes we are not as well organized as Denmark and Sweden. So we have, you know, it all depends how you organize yourself. But let me make clear that in any case, you know, I'm certainly not saying that we should push total tax revenue above, you know, 50 or 50%. So let me again be very clear about the fact that when we talk about 80% tax rate, you know, on the graph for the United States of America, we are not talking of having 80% on everybody. You know, if we were to have 80% tax rate on anybody or anybody above average income, you know, it would certainly be a catastrophe for the entire society. We are talking about, when we are talking of tax rate above 50%, you know, we are talking on incomes that are really excessive, that have nothing to do with productivity and performance, and sometimes in the financial sector, which had even negative impact on the working of the real economy, because this contributed to very short-term decisions. So I think, you know, we should have this discussion. You know, is it useful to pay people in the financial sector several $1 million? This is useful to pay managers $10 million. You know, it's all a matter of proportion. So let's not be ideological about, you know, this magical 50% number of tax rate. You know, it's a, you know, of course, if it was for the entire society, 80% tax rate, it would make no sense. But if this is for you know, incomes that are, you know, several $1 million that are not useful for society, let's look very concretely and you know, at this.
Okay. Just a slide.
Yeah, I think I agree with Nelson that the financial sector is one of the key industries in the economic development. And I think the most important problem with the financial integrity is related to too big to fail. A lot of big banks actually are privatizing their profits, but socializing their losses. So when they make money, they put the money into their pockets. But when they lose money, it's been socialized to every taxpayer. That's the problem. And quite frankly, we have no way to solve this problem so far. Okay, but when it comes to solution, I agree with Maurice. I believe in education. I think Maurice, Thomas, and most of us will see education as one of the most important way of addressing the problem of economic development and inequality. 我想我还是用中文好了哈。Actually, our Constitution places a lot of emphasis on education. Let me show you this. 宪法其实非常重视教育。你看这个宪法的条文写到这个地步，够细吧？政府应广设奖学金名额，辅助学行绩优、无力升学的学生。他不希望任何一个穷困的学生，因为家里没有钱而被阻挡在学校以外。然后，他要保障教育、科学、艺术工作，要依照国民经济进展，随时提高其待遇。今天在座很多位老师，包括我们的主持人啊，还有我们很多位啊，我们老师的待遇目前怎么样？有多少人没有提高啊？那然后奖励私人先学，他特别指示国家要奖励跟补助私人的这一些教育机构。那但是呢，刚才几位先生也提到了，我们现在的税，各位可以看得到，你看就是这个民国101年，就是2012。我们这个 A 的部分呢是没有包括社会安全捐啊，我们就单纯看100块钱的 GDP 里面的话，12块8，美国18块9，法国是28块3，显然我们的租税是低的，然后债务是高的。2009年，我拿最近这5年，2009年呢，中央政府没有包括地方政府，债务余额是3兆7788亿新台币。你看最右边到2013去年呢，已经累积到5兆1223亿，5年中间呢，平均1年增加2687亿元的债务。那在这个情况下，我们如果要求政府再去大量的增加这些教育经费，其实是非常困难的。我个人在这个政府服务过，刚才几位先生提到，我们遗产税从50%降到 10%，其实那个当时也是出于善意，希望能够吸引更多的基金回来投资。我们没有要去怀疑政府有什么这一些不好的意图。那这个刚才提到的是全球化一个很自然一个结果。但是呢，我们其实这个税的部分确实是有很多可以检讨的空间。今天大概没有时间来谈。那么这个是最近这一期《天下》杂志，它引用这个一个统计数字，每一个大学生的教育经费呢，我们台湾平均是34万块一年。OECD 41万，到美国77万，我们不到美国的一半。然后师生比，一个老师，一个大学老师教大学生，台湾是一个人要教21.7，日本大概只有10.1。那这个原因在哪里？不是说学校不愿意请老师，实在是经费上的这些问题。那么这个正好呢，大概是前天的《联合报》的这个一版头的标题。这个我没有经过你同意，不过我想你们大概也不介意我来在这个地方引用一下啊。这个是一版头，说是高中英听呢城乡差距有够大啊，北部 A 级王，中南部 B 级多，东部惨兮兮啊 ，F 还有 F 级 ，C 意思就是听不太懂啊，这个只听懂一点点啊。那然后同一天的报纸 A8， 英听当门槛，弱势生更难进顶尖大学。偏乡先生给我相同的教育资源，你看这个底下副标题，我们怎么考得过台北学生？有些同学无力补习，根本是去垫底。那我想刚才张董事长特别提到这些教育的重要。那 Thomas Piketty， 各位读他的书也知道，他其实也是非常强调教育可以让更多人能够来这个翻上来。那这个是美国奥巴马总统的这个去年的国情咨文，他特别提到，他说 ：“America is not a place where chance of birth or circumstance should decide our destiny。”美国不应该是一个出生决定命运的地方。今天你出生在一个穷人的家庭，出生在偏乡，你不管怎么努力，一辈子爬不上来，这个是不对的。我们古话说呢，“将相本无种”。男儿女儿当自强啊！那换句话说，你只要能够努力，刚才我们张董事长提到，基本上你就可以一步步上来啊。那我想这个是一个健康社会的一个表征。那这个是奥巴马总统去年12月他的另外一个演讲，他就提到说，贫富差距大了之后，伴随而来的效果是什么？是社会阶层流动的僵化。他提到说，顶层的20%的家庭的小孩有2/3的机会可以留在原地，但是底层的20%的小孩爬上来机会不到5%。那我们台湾，我想我们大概没有人愿意看到这个情况。那在这个地方呢，我们刚刚提到政府的财政是困窘的，我们能不能大家一起来想想看，你我大家用民间的力量来协助我们国家教育的发展？那这个是一个美国一个纽泽西州最高法院的一个旧的判决，那么他就提到说，我们现在很多财富从个人的手上移转到公司的手上，当然公司的所有人当然主要是股东，但是真正在使用、在管理、在支配的，当然也是公司的管理阶层。然后他认为说，在这个情况之下，民众呢期待我们的企业也能够来帮忙这一些教育慈善的机关。那这个官司，刚才我时间大概这个 PowerPoint 闪过去会看到，就是一家中小企业300个员工，他捐了1500块美金给 Princeton 大学，结果股东来告说这个钱是我股东的钱，你不应该捐。那这个纽泽西州最高法院的判决认为说这个捐款没有问题，他提了很多理由，里边中间的一个理由，他是提到说，基本上你公司请人就是从大学里面出来的，大学办得好，学生的品质好，你请到公司来，工作能力就比较好，竞争力就强，其实你也是受益人，整个社会都会受益。所以他说呢，很多公司事实上都响应这样的一个情况，所以他是在50年代那个时候，一年呢大概有3亿美金的公司的捐款。那现在我查过，最近这2年大概是增加到180亿公司的捐款。那这里边的话呢，基本上我是觉得说，他特别还提到，就是说这些捐款对公司以及对整个社会的这个好处。那这个是我们看到几个学校的 校务基金的这个规模，哈佛大学换算成台币是9600亿，它的校务基金；耶鲁是5820亿，斯坦福是4950亿，台大11.7亿。台大还是我们这边最好的一个学校之一啊。那你看这个学生人数，台大比哈佛大学都还多。所以在这个情况之下，我们就看到刚刚那个情况，就是学校经费严重的不足，师生比偏高，然后投资在每一个学生的这个经费也严重的不足。那么这个是我们的所得税法是鼓励也允许大家来做捐赠的。你如果捐给这些慈善机构、捐给教育机构，其实都是可以在税方面列为费用来扣抵的。那我看到我们去年上市上柜公司税后的净利的话呢，总共有1兆4454亿。假定说100块钱里边可以有1块钱拿出来帮忙的话，那一年大概就有140多亿的钱。那所以我的很简单的建议，第一个呢，政府目前有所谓5年500亿，一年大概有100亿。那这个目前教育部计划是到105年的3月，目前的计划。105年3月之后会不会继续？我不知道。我希望它能够继续，不要省这个钱。然后第二个的话，就刚刚讲，我们每一个人呢，是不是能够都一起来帮忙？那我把它叫做100年树人基金。那这个是大家看到前不久一些兵统帮忙这个渐冻人，我想从这个地方可以看得出来，我们的社会还是很有爱心的。我们继续帮忙渐冻人，继续帮忙那些需要帮忙的人。那我也希望大家能够把注意力也能够放在教育机构上面。我们台湾现在也没有黄金，也没有石油，也没有这些天然资源，我们靠的就是一个人力的资源。那今天我们看到张董事长、张执行长他们创办的这些事业，基本上也都是凭着这一些很好的人才一手打造出来的。为了让台湾能够更永续的发展，这个社会能够更丰饶、更公平，我希望大家一起来关心教育。谢谢大家。
Thank you, Justice Lai. It is 5:40. We are supposed to end by 5:45, but we started about 30 minutes late. So I'm not going to extend the time up to 30 minutes. There are about 65 questions, all asking Thomas Piketty to answer. If he wants to do that, he's going to stay for 2 more days. So fortunately, I summarized the majority of the questions. One question, perhaps all the panelists can answer, is Taiwan's heat debate recently about Korea signed FTA with China. It's a question about the globalization pressure on inequality. On the one hand, we should join globalization, otherwise our businesses lose their competitiveness. On the other hand, signing FTA, lower the custom tax, will certainly make many of the local businesses hurt. So that's, I think that's a paradox, both in Taiwan and in many other countries. Thomas, what do you think this globalization pressure on inequality and even the local resistance to globalization?
Well, you know, we have the same debate in Europe today, where we are supposed to have a big treaty between the European Union and the United States, a new trade liberalization treaty next year. So this is, you know, this is the equivalent, you know, the regional equivalent, if you want. So, and it's in the case of the US-European Union treaty, it's relatively large, because the US is about 1/4 of world GDP, and the European Union is 1/4 of world GDP. So this is a big share at this stage. You know, this will decline in the future, of course, as the share of China and other emerging countries increase. But at this stage, this is a big share of the world GDP. And I think in this example, and I would say the same in a trade liberalization treaty in Asia, you know, I think it's important to put more fiscal and social justice into globalization. So if we want to have further trade liberalization. I think at the same time it's important to put in the same treaties some decisions regarding more regulation. And for instance, you know, at this stage we need more fiscal cooperation internationally in order to have, you know, a taxation that is more equitable with respect to different size of businesses. You know, right now, large multinational corporations very often pay effective tax rates that are smaller than our small and medium-sized businesses, which makes no sense at all, either from an equity or efficiency viewpoint. Or, you know, the equivalent was Warren Buffett that was mentioned earlier as paying a lower tax rate than his secretary. And I think this is, if we keep having just more trade liberalization, more globalization, but without any fiscal cooperation to ensure that large multinational corporations and high wealth individuals, high income individuals pay at least as much as the middle class and the poor, you know, then I think, you know, at some point we're going to have a problem and people are going to turn against globalization, and this is already what they are doing, and you know, I can understand why, because, you know, you cannot, if we have the feeling that globalization, that a disproportionate share of the benefits from globalization goes to a small group of large multinational corporations, large wealth group, you know, that's not going to work. So to be very concrete, I think we can have both free trade, free capital flows, and fiscal justice, but this requires, you know, you cannot have free trade, free capital flows in exchange of nothing at all. You need to have automatic transmission of information about cross-border financial assets. You need to have some cooperation on some minimal tax on large multinational corporations, and at least, you know, for the largest corporations, some common corporate tax base, you know, and this is something that in Europe and with the US has been discussed for a long time, and the OECD has tried to make some progress in this direction, but, you know, I think that's not enough to do it at the OECD. I think when you have a large multilateral agreement or bilateral agreement, this is the right place to put that. So, you know, in the case of China, let me say just one word about that. You know, China, you know, is benefiting a lot, and the entire world potentially is benefiting a lot from globalization and world trade and trade with China in particular. But it's not possible, you know, to continue in this direction with such an opacity in you know, financial system and so little transparency about you know, income and wealth dynamics, particularly in China. And I think China should, if China wants to promote, you know, more trade liberalization, it's also important that they move in the direction of more transparency regarding income and wealth in China and at the international level. So when it comes to fight tax havens, when it comes to have exchange of information, you know, I think it's of course it's very difficult for a country of the size of Taiwan with the proximity to China to conduct a tax policy on wealth and inheritance, you know, without more cooperation from China. And you know, China right now has no tax at all on inheritance, no tax at all on property, a lot of opacity in the way the corporations are taxed and the high-income individuals are taxed, and you know that I think ultimately it is in the interest of everybody, including China, to move in the direction of more transparency and more fiscal justice, because you know I think they have a lot to lose from capital flight and from, you know, I don't think they want to become like Russia with you know, wealthy oligarchs having a good life in London and Paris and living you know, living off the dividends taken from the Russian companies, and you know, but on the other, you know, if they don't want to move in this direction, then they have to you know, they have to have a more systematic approach to the regulation of inequality and wealth and income than simply the anti-corruption campaigns that they're having right now, which, you know, it's a little bit the Russian way. You have a lot of inequality, you know, very wealthy oligarchs, and you let this happen, and just in some cases, if someone wants to do politics, you put him in jail. But, you know, I don't think this is a very efficient way to regulate inequality in our global economy. You know, I think we need more systematic approach. So I have nothing against trade liberalization, but this must come with, fiscal justice, transparency about corporate profits, and about how much high wealth and high income individuals are getting from transparency. So, if there is sufficient action against, tax haven and financial opacity and more action in the direction of fiscal cooperation, then, trade liberalization can be more justified.
Nelson, I'm going to ask you, what's your opinion about the increasing pressure of signing FTA, Taiwan signing FTA, and on the other hand, some people will say that most of the benefit go to the rich. What's your opinion?
Well, let me look at it this way. Okay, FTA from two point of views. Number one, from number point of view. There are some people believe that the 5% difference in taxes, we should be more competitive. The 5% should not make our industry less competitive. I look at it another way to look at it. If you have 5% difference every year, which is this literally dollar goes out to no purpose except for government tariff. If a company continue have a 5% difference, extrapolate out 20 years, what the industry can invest in R&D, in infrastructure, in machinery upgrade will be less than your competitors. Trust me, 20 years from now, not even 20 years, 5 years from now, will be totally non-competitive. But even more urgent problem from our point of view, from FTA, is the world is moving toward a so-called regulatory convergence. FTA is not only numbers. It's actually to do with law, legal structures, domestic legal structures as well. Because in order for domestic regulatory conform to the international regulatory structure, that's how we'll survive in the future. At this moment, the audience may not realize, given the business laws, commercial laws exist in Taiwan. Roughly speaking, if you compare it with international standard of regulations, we are about 75% of our laws today need to be redefined. And the FTA will help us to redefine the laws, to meet the world structure, to meet world competition. And we're not doing. And this is very scary. It's more scary than the 5% differences that Koreans are getting the benefits.
Okay. We can come back to this if any of the panelists can say more. But another popular question here is international tax competition. Okay, globalization creates a lot of international tax competition. Sometimes we cut tax because Singapore is lower than ours. That is related to your global capital tax scenario, because that global capital tax has to be based on global information exchange. But for Taiwan, the problem is that we only have, because of our diplomatic condition, we only signed 27 tax treaties with other countries. So tax information exchange is quite unlikely, especially for a country like Taiwan. So international tax competition makes our economy extremely vulnerable. So our tax burden now is less than 13%, perhaps one of the lowest countries in the world. So that will make us have little money in education, health, and various aspects. Perhaps I should ask Morris to start. What's your opinion about this international tax competition and our low tax burden rate? How does that affect inequality?
Well, I think that, of course, you need to look at every single case separately. For instance, if you talk about income tax, I don't think that Taiwan has ever lowered its income tax rates because Hong Kong has lower tax rates or Singapore has lower tax rates. Because, you know, people are the least mobile of everything in global competition. Capital is very mobile. You can press a button and billions of dollars get transferred. Technology is also quite mobile. Technology moves pretty quickly across national borders. People don't move. People are used to living in one country, and they don't move. So just because Singapore has lower income tax rates, I don't think that I don't think Taiwan needs to reduce our tax rates because people won't move. They won't move to Singapore. And corporation tax, I think is the same. Corporations are very, very hard to move also. They move more easily, more readily than people, but they're also pretty hard to move. Anyway, I do not think that neighbor countries' tax rates should influence our own tax rates very much.
Thomas?
Yeah, I think I agree that sometimes we exaggerate how much we need to do the same as our neighbors, and I think there's still some room in the world economy to conduct national tax policy. So you can, it's possible, for instance, to have in open economies to have inheritance tax that are higher than 10%. It is possible, I think, to have more than 13% of GDP in total tax revenue, which makes it much easier to invest more in education and health services and make more equal opportunities. So I think we can still do a lot at the national level, and we certainly don't need to wait to have a global government, to start moving in the direction of more justice and fiscal justice. Otherwise, we are going to wait a long time. So there's a lot that can be done at a national level, and I agree very much with this. Now, still, there are issues that require urgent international cooperation. So on the corporate tax, I will disagree a little bit. Well, it depends. For most corporations, they don't move. You are right that medium or small size businesses, or even medium large, they don't really move, and in a way they are as captive taxpayers as the rest of the population. But the large corporations, they are able to shift their profit around in ways which have become totally unacceptable. Because at the end of the day, what you have is this extreme financial opacity in the way, you through just purely accounting, creative accounting, you relocalize your corporate profits in the territories with the lowest corporate tax rate. You end up in a situation where the largest corporation pay much lower effective tax rate than our small and medium-sized businesses, and this situation is not acceptable. And I think the problem, in particular in Europe, but probably in Asia as well, is that we have been accustomed for very long to have free trade, free capital flows in exchange of no regulation, no fiscal cooperation, nothing at all. But this cannot continue like this. I think it's, otherwise at some point, there will, large segments of our public opinion will turn against this evolution and will go to nationalist solutions, which, I don't favor. But I think it's very important to bring more fiscal justice and to use. You are not going to wait for a global government, but we can use all the international treaties that we have, including the trade treaties, to put this regulation and these regulatory solutions in place in order to have more equal playing field for our actors. Otherwise, you will have increased concentration into a small number of very large corporations and sometimes a small number of very wealthy billionaires, and that's not good for the economy. That's not good for democracy. That's not good from any viewpoint.
Anything to add? Just in time.
Yeah. Morris just talked about the mobility of money, of human being, and of corporation. And I think one thing is not movable. That is real estate, land and houses. But here, as he just said, although our constitution says we have to impose land increment tax on the profits realized from the non-use of labor and capital. However, as a matter of fact, our tax law on those land proceeds has been quite low. And you might be aware, before 1972, the tax rate on that the maximum rate was 100%. But now, you know, Chairman Lee just indicated it's been reduced to about 20%. So this is not quite related to globalization. I think that is more related to our tax system. So, and secondly, about the cooperation. Tom, your book, I remember on page 560, talking about the competition of lowering corporate income tax among the European countries. And your country also imposed up to 75% income tax on income in excess of 1 million euro, right? Is that right? Yeah. So I think maybe we should spend more time to study the French experience. And then we probably can learn from their experience and to structure a more appropriate tax laws.
Okay.
Let me mention that there are many things which are not working well at all in France, and that, you know, there are things to learn, there are things not to learn. So, you know, don't be careful.
Okay. We're about to end, but there's one more last popular question, to my surprise, is to ask Thomas Piketty to compare himself with Karl Marx.
Well, you know, I belong to a generation. I was born in 1971, and I turned 18 in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. So, you know, I was too young to have any temptation with communism. So, and at least with Soviet-type communism. You know, Chinese communism is in a way more interesting, but I don't know if it's really communism or what it is. You know, it's a strange mixture, because these days, you know,
in terms of a theoretical structure.
Yeah, no, I understand. You know, it's Marx. I must say that, you know, the one good thing about the Marx writing, and actually many economists in the 19th century, is that they were very much interested, of course, in distribution and also in the long-run evolution of the distribution. And they were very concerned about how it would change in the long run. Now, the problem in the case of Marx is that I think you know, he had very little data, very little historical information. So, of course, it was much more difficult at his time to collect data than it is now. So this is why, you know, my approach and my book, you know, has nothing to do with Marx, of course, because it's my book is entirely data-centered. It's really a book about the history of distribution. It has, you know, it is very, very different. So it was more difficult at the time of Marx, but, you know, I think he could have paid a little bit more attention to the data that was around him. I put it this way, you know, because I think there were contradictory evolutions, and you know, the way he was predicting only one possible evolution, I think was too extreme. And of course, the main problem is that, you know, he didn't think too much about what would happen the day after you abolish private property, which, you know, it's easy to say you abolish private property, but then how do you organize society the next day? And, you know, that's an important problem which he didn't think much about. And so, you know, we have you know, one century after the Bolshevik Revolution almost. You know, we know that this doesn't work to abolish private property, but I think it's easier for my generation, you know, to open again these questions of inequality under capitalism. What are the ways to regulate inequality? You know, let me say that, you know, the progressive taxation of capital, you know, some people might feel it's too radical, people might feel it's not radical enough, that this is not questioning private property sufficiently. I think this is the right balance, because this is like a permanent land reform, if you want, a permanent revolution, but a peaceful one, because you sort of limit property rights in time. You know, property rights are not permanent. You know, you need to be able to have high return to do, you know, good investment with your capital to make them permanent, but otherwise they will be eroded through time, possibly at very high tax rate if concentration of wealth is too high, so that in effect this will prevent concentration of wealth to be high. So I think it's a compromise, you know, between private property and inequality. Now there are also new forms of you know, intermediate property arrangements that need to be developed, and, you know, and that we need to think through again. So, you know, to me, capital in the 21st century means that we take this question of capital that was asked by Marx and others in the 19th century, but we put it in the 21st century, you know, with all the historical experience that we had and all the big data that we are now able to collect. And so this gives a, you know, very different perspective, although there is, of course, a common concern with distribution and with the long run, which, you know, I think today's economists should have more frequently, and today's economists sometimes spend too much time, you know, doing complicated mathematical models in order to look scientific, but they don't spend enough time collecting data and looking at long-run historical evolutions. And, you know, I hope this work can contribute a little bit to you know, reorient the discipline in this direction.
Okay. I would like to ask the panelists, any objection if we stop here now? Okay. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We
appreciate the
a
moderator
wonderful
and
discussion and some fruitful consensus, I believe. Thank you very much.